Before we begin, allow your attention to slow down, because this is not a story about speed, explosions, or sudden events, but about scale, about distance, and about a size so extreme that the human mind struggles to hold it all at once. Somewhere far beyond the familiar stars of our night sky, far beyond the galaxies we casually imagine, there exists an object so massive that normal language stops being useful. A place where comparisons fail, numbers lose meaning, and intuition quietly gives up. This is not the largest thing you have ever heard of. This is the point where the idea of largest itself begins to collapse. Ton 618 is not simply a black hole. It is a boundary between what we can imagine and what exists regardless of imagination. A boundary where size no longer feels like size, but like an abstraction stretched too far. In the universe we experience, size has context. Mountains feel large because we can walk around them. Planets feel large because we can see them hanging in space. Stars feel large because we know they burn with power beyond anything on Earth. Even galaxies feel large because they contain billions of stars. But Ton 618 does not sit comfortably in this ladder of scale. It breaks it. It does not feel larger in the same way a star feels larger than a planet. It feels different, as though the concept of scale itself has changed rules. To understand Ton 618 is not just to learn about a distant object. It is to confront a question that quietly hides behind all of cosmology. Is there a point where bigger stops being meaningful? Is there a size beyond which comparison fails? Is there a mass so extreme that it no longer fits inside the mental structures evolution gave us? Ton 618 forces us to ask these questions not philosophically, but physically. Because this object exists, it was not imagined. It was not theorized first. It was observed. Detected as a quasar, blazing with energy from a time when the universe was much younger than it is now. A beacon from billions of light years away, powered by something so massive that even calling it a black hole feels inadequate. In this video, we are not here to rush toward conclusions. We are here to move slowly, to stretch our understanding step by step, to explore how astronomers discovered Ton 618, what it is made of, how massive it truly is, and why its size pushes against the limits of everything we thought black holes could be. We will compare it to stars, to galaxies, to other black holes that already seem impossibly large, and at each step the comparisons will begin to fail, not because the science breaks, but because our intuition does. As this journey unfolds, remember that this channel exists for exploration, not certainty. We are following the best observations and models available today, knowing that science evolves as new data arrives. Nothing here is rushed. Nothing here demands belief. It simply asks for attention. If you enjoy slow, thoughtful journey through the universe, where ideas are allowed to unfold without pressure, consider subscribing to Theories Before Sleep, where we explore reality at a pace meant not to overwhelm, but to gently expand how you see the cosmos. Now take a breath, because to understand Ton 618, we must first leave behind the scales we're used to, and once we do, we begin to approach a place where size no longer makes sense in the way it once did. In the next part, we will begin not with Ton 618 itself, but with the question that prepares us to understand it. How big can anything in the universe really be before big stops meaning anything at all? TON 618 exists at a distance so extreme that even describing where it is already begins to strain intuition, because it is not simply far in the everyday sense of the word, but far in a way that forces us to think backward through cosmic history into an era when the universe itself was younger, denser, and more energetic than it is now. What we observe today is not TON 618 as it currently exists, but TON 618 as it was billions of years ago, when the universe was less than half its current age, when galaxies were still assembling, when matter had not yet settled into the quieter structures we are familiar with. The light reaching Earth from this object has been travelling for over 10 billion years, crossing expanding space that stretched beneath it the entire time, meaning that every measurement we make is already a compromise between observation and inference, between what is seen and what must be reconstructed through physics. TON 618 was first identified not as a black hole, but as an exceptionally bright quasar, a point of light so luminous that it outshone the galaxy hosting it, releasing energy at a rate that defied normal explanations. Quasars are among the most energetic objects in the universe, powered by supermassive black holes consuming surrounding matter. But TON 618 stood apart even in this extreme category, not because it was merely brighter, but because its brightness implied something far more massive than astronomers were prepared to encounter. When matter falls toward a black hole, it does not disappear quietly. It forms a rotating disk, heating through friction, accelerating particles to near-light speeds, releasing enormous amounts of radiation before crossing the event horizon. The brighter the quasar, the more mass must be feeding the black hole, and the deeper the gravitational well must be to sustain such a process. TON 618's luminosity suggested a central object so massive that it immediately raised uncomfortable questions about how such a thing could exist at all, especially so early in cosmic time. Black holes grow by accreting matter and by merging with other black holes, processes that require time, structure, and available mass. The universe at that epoch was still forming its largest galaxies, yet TON 618 already appeared to contain a black hole with a mass tens of billions of times greater than the Sun. This was not just larger than expected, it threatened to break the growth models themselves. To grasp why this matters, it helps to slow down and consider what mass actually means at this scale. The Sun contains nearly all the mass of the solar system, and yet compared to a typical supermassive black hole at the centre of a galaxy like the Milky Way, it is insignificant. Sagittarius A, the black hole at our galaxy's centre, has a mass of about 4 million suns, already an object so massive that it warps space-time measurably, bending the paths of stars orbiting nearby. Many galaxies contain black holes, hundreds of millions or even a few billion times the mass of the Sun, and these are already considered extreme. TON 618, by contrast, is estimated to have a mass of around 66 billion suns, possibly more depending on the assumptions used in modelling its accretion disk and emitted radiation. Numbers like this cease to function as intuition-building tools. They become labels rather than guides. Saying 66 billion solar masses does not create an image. It creates a void where imagery fails. To translate this into something more tangible, consider gravity not as a force you feel, but as geometry itself bending under mass. The more mass concentrated in a region, the more dramatically space-time curves, shaping the motion of everything nearby. A black hole of TON 618's mass does not merely sit in space. It defines the space around it on scales comparable to entire star systems. The radius of its event horizon, the boundary beyond which nothing can escape, is so large that if it were placed at the centre of our solar system, it would extend far beyond the orbit of Pluto, engulfing regions we usually think of as vast, empty space. And yet, this is still only the surface, the threshold, not the full gravitational influence which extends much farther, shaping matter and light across distances that defy everyday understanding. The accretion disk surrounding TON 618 is equally staggering, a swirling structure of gas and dust spanning light years, heated to extraordinary temperatures, emitting radiation across the electromagnetic spectrum about formation. How does a black hole grow so large so quickly? Did it begin as an unusually massive seed, perhaps formed through the direct collapse of enormous gas clouds, bypassing the normal stellar route? Did it experience an era of hyper-efficient accretion, consuming matter at rates near or even above theoretical limits? Or did it merge repeatedly with other massive black holes in a dense early environment, assembling its mass through cosmic violence invisible to us now? Each possibility stretches current understanding, not because the physics is unknown, but because the initial conditions required seem rare even on cosmic scales. TON 618 forces astronomers to confront the possibility that the early universe produced structures far more extreme than previously assumed, that our census of cosmic objects may be biased toward the familiar, simply because the unfamiliar is harder to detect and interpret. It also challenges the notion that black hole growth is a slow, steady process, suggesting instead that under certain conditions mass can accumulate with astonishing efficiency, reshaping galaxies and their environments long before the universe settles into maturity. Beyond formation, TON 618 also reframes the relationship between black holes and galaxies. In most models, the mass of a central black hole correlates with properties of its host galaxy, implying a coevolution where feedback processes regulate growth on both sides. Yet TON 618 appears to tip this balance, possessing a black hole whose mass rivals or exceeds the mass of stars in its host galaxy's bulge, disrupting the usual proportionality. This hints at a regime where black holes are not merely passengers in galactic evolution, but dominant architects, capable of influencing structure on scales previously thought to be governed primarily by dark matter and baryonic physics. The radiation emitted by such a quasar can heat surrounding gas, suppress star formation, and alter the chemical evolution of entire regions, meaning that TON 618 was not just a passive object, but an active agent in shaping its cosmic neighbourhood. In this sense, TON 618 is less a singular curiosity and more a signpost pointing toward a class of objects that redefine what large means in the universe. It occupies a conceptual boundary where the language of size, mass, and influence must be reconsidered, not because these quantities cease to exist, but because their familiar hierarchies no longer apply. When an object becomes so massive that it challenges formation models, disrupts galactic scaling relations, and pushes theoretical frameworks into uncomfortable territory, it stops being merely the biggest example of a category and starts to feel like a category of its own. TON 618 does not just sit at the top of a list, it sits at the edge of comprehension, where astronomy, physics, and philosophy intersect, forcing a re-evaluation of how the universe distributes mass and meaning across its vast expanse. TON 6-18 does not only challenge our understanding of how big something can be, it quietly dismantles the idea that size alone is the correct metric for importance. Because at this scale, mass is no longer just a quantity, but a condition that reshapes everything around it. When an object reaches tens of billions of solar masses, gravity stops behaving like an influence confined to a local region and instead becomes a dominant organizing principle across distances that would normally be considered vast. Space-time around TON 6-18 is not merely curved, it is deeply distorted in a way that alters how matter flows, how light travels, and how energy redistributes itself. Photons climbing out of its gravitational well lose energy so dramatically that their wavelengths stretch, reddening light before it ever escapes, meaning that what we observe is already filtered through extreme relativistic effects. Time itself slows near the event horizon relative to distant observers, not as a metaphor but as a measurable consequence of geometry, creating regions where processes unfold at different rates depending on proximity to the mass. At this scale, it becomes impossible to separate the object from its environment, because the environment is defined by the object's presence. The surrounding galaxy does not merely host TON 6-18, it exists under its influence, shaped by radiation, jets, and gravitational dominance that extend far beyond the central core. Matter drawn toward the black hole forms vast inflows that alter the distribution of gas on galactic scales, while powerful outflows driven by radiation pressure and magnetic fields can expel material outward, heating interstellar space and suppressing star formation. This feedback loop means that TON 6-18 is not simply growing within its galaxy, it is actively sculpting it, enforcing limits on how stars form and where matter can settle. At some point, the distinction between the black hole and the galaxy becomes blurred, because the black hole's mass approaches a significant fraction of the galaxy's baryonic content, challenging the assumption that galaxies are the primary structures and black holes secondary components. Instead, TON 6-18 suggests a regime where the black hole may be the central organizing structure, with the galaxy forming as a consequence rather than a container. This inversion of perspective has profound implications for cosmology, because it implies that under certain early universe conditions, mass may have concentrated preferentially into gravitational sinks before stellar populations fully developed, creating environments where black holes dictated structure rather than merely responding to it. As size increases, comparisons lose traction. Saying that TON 6-18 is larger than Sagittarius A or larger than M87's black hole does not convey its significance, because the difference is not incremental but categorical. It is not simply heavier, it occupies a different tier of influence, one where scaling relations derived from smaller systems begin to break down. The Schwarzschild radius grows linearly with mass, but the volume enclosed grows with the cube, meaning that as mass increases, the region from which nothing can escape expands into a domain that feels less like a point and more like a region of space removed from causal interaction. If such an object were placed in our local universe, its presence would not merely alter orbital dynamics, it would redefine what counts as near and far, collapsing intuitive distance scales into abstractions. Even describing the accretion process becomes difficult at this size, because standard thin disk models assume conditions that may not fully apply when disks extend across light years and interact with galactic inflows on comparable scales. Turbulence, magnetic fields, and relativistic jets intertwine in ways that defy simple visualization, producing energy flows that are not just powerful but persistent across cosmic time. The jets associated with such quasars can extend hundreds of thousands of light years, carving channels through intergalactic space, transporting energy far beyond the host galaxy, and influencing regions that would otherwise remain cold and inert. This means that Ton 618's influence is not localized to its immediate surroundings. It leaks outward, imprinting structure across scales that blur the boundary between galactic and intergalactic environments. When size reaches this level, the universe stops feeling like a collection of objects interacting within a background and starts feeling like a continuous system where dominant masses reorganize space itself. The question then shifts from how large Ton 618 is to what its existence implies about the universe's capacity for extremes. If such an object can form once, it suggests that the upper limits of black hole mass are not sharply defined by known physics, but by initial conditions and cosmic history, meaning that what we observe may be less a boundary and more a sample. Ton 618 could represent the tail end of a distribution we barely glimpse, hinting at other objects of comparable or even greater mass that remain undetected due to distance, orientation, or observational bias. This realization subtly shifts our relationship with cosmic scale. Instead of viewing the universe as neatly tiered, with planets below stars, stars below galaxies, and galaxies below clusters, Ton 618 introduces a sense of continuity, where mass can pile up in ways that defy hierarchical expectations. At this scale, even the language of domination becomes inadequate, because domination implies competition, and there is nothing competing with Ton 618 in its immediate environment. It simply exists as a gravitational sink so deep that surrounding processes align themselves around it by necessity rather than choice. The human mind evolved to navigate environments where size differences mattered locally and incrementally. Mountains are larger than hills, oceans larger than lakes, but all remain within a scale where experience provides reference. Ton 618 lies entirely outside that domain. There is no experiential anchor, no intuitive ladder, only mathematical descriptions that gesture towards something too vast to be felt. This is where the phrase, the point where size stops making sense, becomes literal rather than poetic. Size stops being a measure of comparison and becomes a statement about limits of cognition. Beyond a certain threshold, adding more mass does not enrich understanding, it dissolves it, forcing reliance on abstraction alone. Ton 618 exists not just as an astrophysical object, but as a reminder that the universe permits concentrations of matter so extreme that they push the tools of explanation to their edge. It is not the terror of gravity or the drama of collapse that makes it unsettling, but the quiet realization that nothing in our everyday understanding prepares us for structures of this magnitude. In confronting Ton 618, we are not merely learning about a black hole, we are confronting the mismatch between human-scaled intuition and cosmic reality. A mismatch that becomes unavoidable when size cruises from large into incomprehensible. Ton 618 does something subtle but profound to our understanding of cosmic limits. because it does not merely sit near the upper edge of what we thought possible. It forces us to ask whether such an edge truly exists at all, or whether it was simply an assumption shaped by incomplete observation. In physics, limits often emerge not because something is forbidden, but because the conditions required to exceed them are statistically rare. A mountain can grow taller, a star can become heavier, a galaxy can grow larger, but each step upward becomes less likely as opposing forces increase. Gravity pulls matter together, while pressure, radiation, and angular momentum resist collapse. In stars, fusion pressure balances gravity until fuel runs out. In galaxies, rotation and feedback regulate growth. In black holes, however, the usual internal resistance disappears once matter crosses the event horizon, leaving only external constraints to limit growth. Those constraints are environmental rather than intrinsic, meaning that the size of a black hole is less about what physics allows and more about what the universe happens to provide. TON 618 appears to have existed in an environment where constraints were unusually weak and supply unusually abundant. The early universe was dense, rich in gas, and chaotic, with matter flowing along filaments into growing structures. Under such conditions, mass could funnel toward gravitational centers at rates difficult to sustain later in cosmic history. TON 618 likely formed during this turbulent era, when the universe was not yet orderly enough to limit extremes. This suggests that the largest black holes are not necessarily products of slow accumulation, but of brief windows when conditions align just right, allowing runaway growth before feedback mechanisms fully engage. Once such an object exists, it becomes self-reinforcing. Its gravity attracts more matter, its radiation reshapes its surroundings, and its presence alters the flow of gas on scales large enough to sustain continued feeding. This does not mean unlimited growth, but it does mean that growth becomes less linear and more opportunistic, driven by rare alignments rather than steady processes. TON 618 sits at the intersection of these dynamics, a fossil of an era when the universe was permissive in ways it no longer is. The fact that we observe it at all implies that the universe once tolerated concentrations of mass that now seem excessive, even extravagant. This forces a re-evaluation of how universal our current models truly are. Models are built from the data available, and data is constrained by what survives, what shines, and what we can detect across immense distances. TON 618 shines precisely because it is extreme, because its accretion disk radiates enormous energy, announcing its presence across cosmic time. Yet for every object like TON 618 that announces itself, there may be others that remain hidden, either because their accretion has quieted, or because their orientation obscures their emission. This raises the unsettling possibility that our census of cosmic extremes is incomplete, not by a small margin, but by entire categories. If TON 618 represents the visible tip of a population of ultra-massive black holes, formed early and later starved of fuel, then the universe may contain relics of scale far beyond what current observations suggest. Such objects would not dominate their environments dramatically today, but their past influence would be written into the structure of galaxies and the distribution of matter on large scales. Another implication lies in the relationship between black hole mass and cosmic time. Conventional wisdom once suggested that the largest black holes should appear later, having had more time to grow. TON 618 violates this intuition by existing so early with such immense mass, implying that growth was not merely a function of time but of conditions. Time alone is not enough. Environment matters, density matters, flow matters. This reframes the early universe not as a simple starting point, but as a uniquely fertile phase for extremes, a phase whose effects echo forward long after its conditions fade. TON 618 thus becomes a probe not just of black hole physics, but of cosmic history itself. Its existence encodes information about how matter behaved when the universe was young, how quickly structure formed, and how violently mass could concentrate before equilibrium began to assert itself. There is also a deeper conceptual shift forced by objects like TON 618, one that moves us away from thinking of the universe as optimized for moderation. Human intuition often expects balance, expects that extremes cancel out or self-correct, but physics does not enforce moderation, only consistency. If the equations allow runaway processes under certain conditions, then those processes will occur wherever conditions permit. TON 618 is evidence that the universe does not prefer neat scales. It tolerates extremes without hesitation. This realization carries philosophical weight because it undermines the assumption that what we observe locally reflects global norms. The Milky Way's black hole is modest by cosmic standards, but that modesty is not a rule, only a circumstance. TON 618 exists as a reminder that the universe's capacity for scale far exceeds the environments in which human intuition evolved. When we attempt to visualize TON 618, we often default to images of darkness, of swallowing light, of cosmic monsters, but these metaphors miss the point. The unsettling aspect of TON 618 is not its violence, but its indifference. It does not rage, it does not consume out of hunger, it simply sits where geometry demands, allowing matter to fall because space-time is shaped in such a way that falling is inevitable. There is no drama at the event horizon, no final flash, only the quiet continuation of trajectories that cannot avoid convergence. At this scale, the universe does not appear hostile or benign, only unconcerned. TON 618 did not form to challenge theory, yet it does. It did not grow to provoke awe, yet it does. It exists because the universe once allowed it to exist, and that allowance is perhaps the most unsettling implication of all. If such an object can form once, then the universe's potential for extremes is not bounded by comfort or intuition. TON 618 stands as a checkpoint, a marker where we must admit that our sense of proportion is not a reliable guide to cosmic reality. Beyond it, numbers still function, equations still apply, but meaning thins out. Size no longer tells a story of gradual increase. It tells a story of qualitative shift, where accumulation becomes dominance, and dominance becomes abstraction. In this way, TON 618 is not merely the largest known black hole. It is a signal that the universe is willing to go far beyond what feels reasonable, and that our task is not to tame that realization, but to learn how to think clearly in its presence. TON 618 ultimately forces a confrontation with a question that physics often postpones rather than resolves: the question of whether the universe imposes meaningful upper limits on structure, or whether limits are simply artifacts of the environments we happen to observe most easily. In everyday experience, limits feel natural. There is a tallest mountain on Earth, a largest animal that can survive under gravity, a maximum speed imposed by friction and material strength. These limits arise because competing forces balance each other in stable ways. Gravity pulls downward, pressure resists collapse, energy dissipates and equilibrium emerges. For a long time, black holes seem to fit comfortably into this framework, growing until feedback processes throttled further accumulation. Radiation from accretion disks heats surrounding gas, jets expel matter, angular momentum prevents infinite infall, and growth slows. This picture suggests a natural ceiling, not enforced by fundamental law, but by environmental self-regulation. TON 618 destabilizes this intuition because it appears to have bypassed or overwhelmed these regulatory mechanisms long enough to reach a mass where the word ceiling begins to feel arbitrary. If feedback always won, objects like this should be extraordinarily rare or non-existent. And yet it is luminous enough to be seen across most of the observable universe. This does not mean physics failed. It means physics allowed something that intuition quietly assumed it would prevent. When examining upper bounds, it becomes important to distinguish between hard limits and soft limits. A hard limit is encoded directly into fundamental law, like the speed of light in vacuum or the conservation of energy. A softer limit emerges statistically, a boundary enforced not by impossibility, but by improbability. Black hole mass appears to fall into the latter category. Nothing in general relativity forbids arbitrarily large black holes. The equations remain valid whether the mass is 10 solar masses or 10 trillion. What changes is not legality, but likelihood. Conditions required to assemble such mass into a single region become increasingly rare as the universe evolves. TON 618 therefore does not violate a law. It occupies a corner of parameter space that the universe briefly allowed. The unsettling implication is that there may be no meaningful upper bound in principle, only in practice. If the early universe had been slightly denser, slightly more chaotic, slightly more permissive, objects even larger than TON 618 could have formed, leaving behind relics we may never detect. This reframes TON 618 not as an outlier brushing against a cosmic wall, but as a data point hinting that the wall might not exist. The concept of largest known then becomes a statement about observation rather than reality. Known is constrained by what shines, what aligns with our instruments, and what survives long enough to be seen. Unknown remains vast. Another subtle implication concerns the nature of scale itself. Scale is meaningful when differences matter, when being twice as large produces a qualitatively different outcome. A star twice as massive burns faster, lives shorter, ends differently. A galaxy twice as massive hosts more stars, more structure, but beyond a certain point increases in mass stop producing new categories of behaviour. A black hole with 10 billion solar masses and one with 50 billion solar masses differ, numerically, but both already dominate their environments completely. Both already curve space-time so strongly that classical intuition fails. Both already impose relativistic regimes over vast regions. The difference exists mathematically but not experientially. TON 618 may therefore represent not the maximum size, but the threshold beyond which size no longer introduces new phenomena. Beyond this threshold, adding mass does not deepen understanding, it simply extends abstraction. This is what makes TON 618 philosophically heavy. It marks the point where scale stops being explanatory and starts being descriptive only. The universe does not announce such thresholds. They are discovered retroactively when observation catches up with possibility. TON 618 was not predicted as a necessary outcome of theory. it was encountered, forcing theory to adapt. This is often how progress occurs, not through elegant foresight, but through uncomfortable surprise. There is also a temporal dimension to limits that TON 618 highlights. The universe is not static in its capacity to generate extremes. Early on, when matter was dense and structures forming rapidly, the universe could explore regions of possibility space that later became inaccessible. Expansion, cooling, and entropy gradually closed doors that were once open. TON 618 is a fossil from that permissive era, a remnant of conditions that no longer exist. This suggests that the universe's most extreme objects may not be those forming now or in the future, but those that formed early and persisted. If so, then the search for limits must look backward rather than forward. The larger structures may already exist, quietly aging in a universe that can no longer replicate their formation. This challenges a common assumption that progress moves toward ever greater extremes. In cosmology, the opposite may be true. Extremes peak early, then fade into rarity as equilibrium asserts itself. TON 618 is not the beginning of a trend. It may be the echo of a peak. This realization reshapes how we think about cosmic destiny. If the universe once allowed such concentration of mass and now does not, then the future is not one of escalation but of dilution. The most dramatic scales may already be behind us. TON 618 stands at the far end of a curve that bends downward, not upward. Yet even this does not restore comfort, because it leaves us with the universe whose capacity for extremes was greater than we imagined, even if that capacity is now diminishing. TON 618 teaches that limits in cosmology are contextual, historical, and conditional. They depend on when and where, not on what is fundamentally allowed. The universe is not obligated to remain within the bounds of human intuition. It is obligated only to obey its own equations, and those equations, indifferent and precise, do not care whether the results feel reasonable. TON 618 exists because nothing prevented it from existing at the moment it formed. That alone is enough. It does not require justification, narrative, or significance beyond consistency. In confronting it, we are forced to recognize that the universe does not scale itself to our understanding. Instead, it occasionally produces objects so vast that understanding must stretch or fracture to accommodate them. Whether TON 618 is the largest black hole that will ever be known is almost irrelevant. What matters is that its existence demonstrates a willingness on the part of reality to explore extremes without apology. It is a reminder that the universe's true limits, if they exist at all, are not drawn where we expect them to be. TON 618 does not simply occupy a corner of astrophysics. It presses outward into the way we think about existence at cosmic scale, because when an object reaches this magnitude, it stops behaving like a thing among other things and starts behaving like a condition imposed upon space itself. In everyday reasoning, objects exist within space, but TON 618 inverts that relationship. Its mass is so concentrated that the geometry of space-time in its vicinity is defined primarily by its presence, making it less accurate to say that the black hole exists in space than to say that space exists in a form dictated by the black hole. This distinction matters because it reveals how fragile our object-based intuition really is. We instinctively think in terms of entities, boundaries, and separations, yet at this scale, those categories blur into something closer to continuous structure. TON 618 is not merely large, it is structurally dominant. It sets conditions rather than merely responding to them. When matter approaches, it does not interact with a surface in the familiar sense. It follows geodesics carved by curvature so extreme that alternative paths barely exist. This transforms gravity from an influence into a landscape, one where motion is not chosen but compelled. The implications ripple outward. If space can be reshaped so thoroughly by mass, then the universe is not a neutral backdrop punctuated by objects, but an active medium whose properties vary depending on how matter organizes itself. Tion 618 demonstrates that the universe permits arrangements where local reality diverges radically from the cosmic average, not through exotic physics, but through the accumulation of ordinary mass in extraordinary ways. This reframes our understanding of uniformity. On the larger scales, the universe appears smooth and homogeneous, but Tion 618 reminds us that this smoothness coexists with pockets of extreme deviation, regions where the rules are the same but their consequences are magnified beyond intuitive reach. Such regions are not anomalies in the sense of errors. They are natural outcomes of probability played out over vast volumes and timescales. The universe does not avoid extremes, it samples them wherever conditions allow. Tion 618 is one such sample, a realization of potential rather than a violation of norm. Its existence also exposes a tension between measurement and meaning. Astronomers can estimate its mass, luminosity and distance, assign uncertainties and refine models, but none of these actions restore intuitive grasp. Measurement succeeds where comprehension fails. We can know the numbers without knowing what they feel like. This gap is not a flaw in science, it is a consequence of scale. Human cognition evolved to navigate environments where differences mattered locally, where cause and effect were tightly coupled, where size correlated with experience. Tion 618 exists outside that regime. It demands abstraction without reward, forcing acceptance without visualization. In this sense, it is one of the purest examples of how the universe resists anthropocentric framing. It does not present itself in digestible increments. It leaps, it accumulates, it overwhelms. Another layer of significance emerges when considering what Tion 618 implies about cosmic evolution as a whole. The universe began in a state of extreme density and simplicity, expanded rapidly, diversified into structures, and is now slowly drifting toward dilution. Tion 618 appears at an intermediate moment in this arc, a time when structure had formed but equilibrium had not yet asserted dominance. It embodies a peak condition, where mass concentration and available energy briefly align to produce something unprecedented. In this way, Tion 618 is less a singular marvel than a marker of transition. It signals that the universe once occupied a regime where extremes were more accessible, where growth could outpace regulation, where the balance between accumulation and dispersal temporarily favored accumulation. That regime is fading. As expansion continues and energy gradients flatten, the universe becomes less capable of producing such objects. Tion 618 therefore stands as a relic of possibility, a survivor from a phase when the universe was more permissive than it is now. This temporal framing strips away the temptation to mythologize. Tion 618 is not a monster lurking at the edge of reality, it is a consequence of timing. Had it formed later, it might never have reached its observed mass. Had it formed earlier, it might have grown even larger. Its size is contingent, not ordained. That contingency extends to us as observers. We are able to detect TON 618 because it shines as a quasar, because its orientation and activity align with our instruments, because its light survives the journey across expanding space. Countless other extremes may have existed and vanished without trace, leaving no beacon to announce them. TON 618 is not evidence that the universe prefers excess. It is evidence that the universe allows it. This allowance has no moral weight, no intention. It simply follows from the interplay of density, gravity, and time. The philosophical discomfort arises when we realize that allowance does not care about comprehensibility. The universe does not ensure that what exists can be meaningfully grasped by the systems that observe it. TON 618 exposes this indifference gently but unmistakably. It does not challenge our place emotionally. It challenges our frameworks intellectually. It suggests that reality is under no obligation to remain within the bounds of concepts shaped by survival on a small planet around an average star. When confronted with TON 618, the temptation is to ask what comes next, whether even larger objects await discovery, whether there is a final ceiling beyond which accumulation breaks down. But this question may itself be misplaced. The more unsettling realization is that beyond a certain point, next loses relevance. Once scale exceeds the capacity of intuition, further increase does not deepen insight, it only extends abstraction. TON 618 sits at that boundary. It is large enough to reveal the limits of size as an explanatory tool, yet still finite, still describable, still anchored in law. It occupies a liminal zone where physics remains intact but narrative collapses. In that collapse, something important is revealed. The universe is not structured to be understood, only to be consistent. TON 618 does not exist to teach a lesson, but it teaches one nonetheless. It teaches that reality's willingness to explore extremes is bounded only by what is possible, not by what is sensible. And in recognizing this, we begin to see the universe not as a hierarchy of scales neatly stacked, but as a continuum where certain regions become so dominant that scale itself ceases to guide understanding. TON 618 is one of those regions, a place where size no longer clarifies, where magnitude no longer explains, and where the universe quietly demonstrates that its deepest truths are often found not where things are balanced, but where they become overwhelming. TON 618 ultimately leaves us not with a conclusion, but with a pressure point in understanding, a place where explanation continues to function mathematically, while intuition quietly disengages. Physics does not fail here. The equations of general relativity remain intact, the models of accretion still operate, the observations still align within uncertainty. What fails is not knowledge, but the expectation that knowledge must feel meaningful in a human sense. TON 618 demonstrates that the universe does not scale its structures to cognition. It produces objects that are describable without being graspable, measurable without being relatable, lawful without being narratively satisfying. This realization shifts the role of understanding itself. Instead of seeking comfort or closure, understanding becomes an act of alignment with reality as it is, even when that reality offers no intuitive reward. TON 618 exists at a scale where explanation no longer builds a story, but draws a boundary around what can be coherently framed. Beyond that boundary, we do not encounter mystery in the romantic sense, but neutrality, a regime where facts accumulate without converging toward insight. This is not a limitation imposed by ignorance, but by scale. There are regimes where adding detail no longer sharpens comprehension, only increases abstraction. TON 618 resides firmly in that regime. It does not deepen when examined longer. It remains equally resistant, equally complete, equally indifferent. In this way, it becomes a mirror held up to the act of inquiry itself. We ask questions because questions once mattered for survival, orientation, and meaning. But the universe does not guarantee that every question has an answer that satisfies the structure of the mind asking it. TON 618 answers every scientific question posed to it within the limits of observation, yet still leaves something unresolved, not because something is hidden, but because nothing more can be extracted that changes the picture. It is not an enigma to be solved. It is a condition to be accepted. This acceptance does not weaken science. It clarifies its scope. Science excels at describing how reality behaves, not at ensuring that behavior aligns with intuition. TON 618 behaves exactly as allowed by physical law. That alone is sufficient. There is no further justification required. When we ask whether TON 618 is meaningful, the honest response is that meaning was never its responsibility. Meaning arises in observers, not in objects. TON 618 does not contain significance. It provokes it. And that provocation reveals something essential about the universe as a whole. Reality does not optimize for balance, moderation, or comprehensibility. It explores possibility wherever probability allows, and then moves on, leaving behind remnants that persist long after the conditions that formed them have vanished. TON 618 is one such remnant. It does not signal a future of ever-growing extremes, nor does it warn of collapse. It simply marks a moment when the universe's capacity for concentration briefly exceeded our expectations. That moment passed. The object remains. As the universe continues to expand and dilute, conditions like those that birthed TON 618 become less accessible, not forbidden, but unlikely. The future of the cosmos is not one of escalation, but of quieting. Extremes will not multiply. They will persist as echoes. TON 618 will not grow forever. It will eventually exhaust its fuel, its quasar phase fading, its influence becoming gravitational rather than radiant. It will remain massive, dominant, but silent, a gravitational monument embedded in an aging universe. And yet, even in that silence, its existence will not change. It does not depend on attention, interpretation, or awe. It existed before we noticed it, and will persist after we stop observing it. This persistence strips away any temptation to anthropomorphize. TON 618 does not challenge us intentionally. It does not announce a lesson. It simply occupies a region of reality that reveals the limits of conceptual comfort. In doing so, it clarifies something often overlooked. The universe does not need to be dramatic to be profound. Its most unsettling features are not explosive or violent, but quietly excessive, calmly disproportionate, fundamentally unconcerned with the scales we find manageable. TON 618 is not terrifying because it threatens us. It is unsettling because it demonstrates how small the domain of intuitive understanding truly is. It reminds us that the universe is under no obligation to remain within the conceptual scaffolding built by a species that emerged on a single planet during a brief window of cosmic calm. And yet, this realization does not diminish inquiry, it refines it. To study TON 618 is not to conquer it intellectually, but to learn how to think clearly in the presence of overwhelming scale. It teaches restraint rather than mastery, acceptance rather than resolution. At the point where size stops making sense, explanation does not end, but expectation does. What remains is a universe that continues exactly as it always has, governed by laws that neither comfort nor confuse, producing structures that do not ask to be understood. TON 618 is one of those structures. It exists fully, lawfully, indifferently, and that ultimately is enough. TON 618 also exposes a quieter boundary, one that does not belong to physics but to interpretation, because while equations can extend indefinitely, explanation cannot always follow without thinning into repetition. At some scale, describing more precisely no longer changes understanding, it merely refines numbers that point to the same conceptual conclusion. This is where TON 618 becomes instructive, not as an object but as a test of intellectual discipline. The temptation when encountering extremes is to keep escalating language, to reach for stronger metaphors, larger comparisons, more dramatic framing, but none of that deepens clarity. TON 618 resists narrative escalation because it does not participate in narrative structure. There is no arc, no progression, no climax hidden inside its mass. It does not evolve toward revelation. It simply persists as a stable consequence of earlier conditions. This forces a reconsideration of what counts as learning. Learning is often mistaken for accumulation, the gathering of more facts, more details, more parameters. Yet with TON 618, learning takes a different form. It becomes the recognition that additional detail does not always translate into additional insight. Knowing its mass to higher precision does not alter what it represents. Knowing its spin more accurately does not change the nature of its dominance. The object remains what it is, overwhelming in scale, indifferent in presence, resistant to being folded into familiar explanatory structures. This does not diminish the value of precision, but it reveals its limits. Precision sharpens boundaries. It does not dissolve them. TON 618 sits precisely at such a boundary. Another implication follows from this. If explanation has diminishing returns at extreme scale, then the role of theory subtly shifts. Theory no longer seeks to predict novelty, but to contextualize inevitability. TON 618 is not surprising because it behaves strangely. It is surprising because it exists at all. Once it exists, its behavior is almost anticlimactic. Matter falls, energy radiates, space-time curves. Everything proceeds exactly as expected. The shock is not in the mechanics, but in the allowance. The universe permitted this accumulation, and once permitted, the outcome followed predictably. This reveals a fundamental asymmetry in how we experience discovery. We often expect the unknown to be exotic, but the most unsettling discoveries are those that are perfectly ordinary in behaviour yet extraordinary in scale. TON 618 belongs to this category. It does nothing new. It simply does far more of what is already known. That more is what destabilizes intuition. The realization that the universe can amplify familiar processes to such an extent without qualitative change challenges the expectation that scale always introduces novelty. Sometimes it only introduces saturation. At this point, inquiry becomes reflective rather than exploratory. The question is no longer what does this object do, but what does encountering this object do to us? TON 618 compresses perspective. It makes human timescales, distances and concerns feel transient without dramatizing that transience. There is no moral lesson embedded in its existence, no warning, no promise. It simply reframes proportion. This reframing has consequences for how we think about the cosmos as a whole. If the universe can generate objects that exceed our conceptual comfort by such margins, then the limits of understanding are not defined by ignorance alone, but by mismatch between cognitive scale and physical scale. This mismatch cannot be solved by education alone, because it is structural. Human minds evolved to navigate environments where feedback was immediate, scale differences were moderate, and consequences were local. TON 618 occupies a regime where feedback is delayed by billions of years. Scale differences are astronomical in the literal sense, and consequences unfold across volumes that erase locality altogether. No amount of explanation can make this regime feel natural, because naturalness is an adaptation, not a truth criterion. Recognizing this reframes humility not as resignation, but as accuracy. To admit that understanding thins at certain scales is not to abandon inquiry, but to align it with reality's contours. TON 618 does not demand that we stop asking questions. It demands that we stop expecting questions to converge toward comfort. There is also a broader lesson about categorization. Human knowledge relies heavily on classification, on grouping phenomena into types, ranges, and hierarchies. TON 618 resists easy classification because it stretches categories without breaking them. It is still a black hole. It still follows the same laws. And yet it feels miscategorized because it expands the category beyond intuitive reach. This exposes the provisional nature of categories themselves. Categories are tools, not truths. They work until they don't. And TON 618 marks a point where the tool still functions formally, but fails psychologically. This failure is instructive. It reminds us that the universe does not organize itself into neat bins. We impose bins to manage complexity. When reality exceeds those bins, the correct response is not to force it back inside, but to acknowledge the overflow. TON 618 overflows not physically, but conceptually. It does not spill matter, it spills expectation. Finally, TON 618 places a quiet constraint on ambition. Not the ambition to understand, but the ambition to master. Mastery implies control, containment, or at least conceptual ownership. TON 618 offers none of these. It cannot be visited, influenced, or fully internalized. It can only be described from a distance, inferred through models, and accepted as part of a universe that does not scale itself to human intention. This acceptance does not reduce wonder. It purifies it. Wonder stripped of illusion, stripped of narrative hunger, stripped of the need for payoff. TON 618 does not culminate in revelation. It culminates in recognition. Recognition that some structures exist not to be resolved, but to be acknowledged as stable features of a reality far larger than the frameworks we bring to it. In this way, TON 618 does not answer a question. It clarifies the conditions under which questions themselves remain meaningful. Beyond that, explanation does not fail. It simply stops advancing. And that stopping point, that quiet plateau where further detail no longer changes perspective, is itself a kind of knowledge. TON 618 ultimately leaves us standing at a threshold where inquiry no longer expands outward, but turns inward, not toward emotion or belief, but toward the structure of understanding itself. At this point, the universe does not become unknowable, but it becomes exhaustively knowable in a way that paradoxically removes the need to know more. All relevant questions can be asked, all relevant equations applied, all relevant observations refined. Yet none of these actions change the central fact that Ton 618 exists as a stable, lawful consequence of earlier cosmic conditions. There is no hidden layer waiting to be uncovered that will suddenly make it feel smaller, more reasonable, or more narratively satisfying. The object does not conceal a secret. It exposes a saturation point. Beyond this point, additional explanation ceases to reorganize perspective. It accumulates without transforming. This is not a failure of science, but a characteristic of scale. When phenomena exceed the range where human cognition naturally forms distinctions, understanding becomes flat, not because nothing is known, but because everything that matters is already accounted for. Ton 618 does not resist analysis. It completes it. Once its mass, distance, accretion behavior and environment are understood within uncertainty, nothing qualitatively new remains to be added. The object does not evolve toward a revelation, and neither does our relationship with it. This completion is unsettling because it runs counter to how meaning usually operates. Meaning, for human minds, is often tied to progression, to the sense that effort leads somewhere. Ton 618 reveals a regime where effort leads to stability rather than ascent. The universe in this regime is not withholding insight, it is offering a finished condition. This reframes the act of explanation from conquest to alignment. To understand Ton 618 is not to master it, but to accept that it represents a limit where comprehension transitions from active to passive. Passive understanding is not ignorance, it is recognition without demand. This recognition carries implications far beyond black holes. It suggests that the universe contains regions of conceptual closure, places where questions no longer branch into new questions but loop back onto the same answer. This exists because nothing prevented it from existing. Such regions do not negate curiosity, they discipline it. They draw a boundary around where curiosity produces insight and where it produces only repetition. Ton 618 is one such boundary. It does not invite endless speculation, because speculation does not alter its significance. It invites acknowledgement. This acknowledgement reshapes how we think about the cosmos as a whole. Instead of imagining the universe as an endless ladder of deeper explanations, we are confronted with a landscape where some features are terminal, not in time, but in intelligibility. They do not end inquiry, they complete it locally. Beyond them, inquiry continues elsewhere, but not through them. Ton 618 stands as a fixed point in this landscape, not because it is immutable, but because its mutability does not matter. It will accrete, fade, quiet, persist, but none of these changes alter what it represents. It remains an object whose scale exceeds the utility of scale itself. This realization subtly dissolves a common assumption that understanding must always deepen. Sometimes understanding stabilizes. Sometimes the correct response to knowledge is not to push further, but to stop pushing and allow the implications to settle. Ton 618 teaches this without instruction. It does not signal completion with finality. It signals sufficiency. Everything necessary to contextualize it exists within current physics, and everything beyond that adds detail without consequence. In this way, Ton 618 is not an invitation to awe in the emotional sense, but to precision in humility. It clarifies that the universe is not structured as a narrative that escalates toward meaning, but as a system that permits extremes wherever probability allows and then remains indifferent to their interpretation. TON 6018 does not sit at the end of a story. It sits at the edge of usefulness. Past that edge, explanation continues mechanically, but significance does not increase. And this, finally, may be the most important lesson it offers. The universe does not promise that understanding will always feel rewarding. It promises only that consistency will hold. TON 618 is consistent. It obeys law. It fits within theory. And yet it resists being absorbed into intuition. That resistance is not an obstacle. It is information. It tells us where the universe stops needing us to follow. Beyond that point, reality continues perfectly well without conceptual accompaniment. TON 618 remains massive, lawful, indifferent, not as a climax, not as a mystery, but as a quiet confirmation that the universe's deeper structures do not exist to be meaningful, only to be what they are. TON 618 also reveals something subtle about permanence, because while it appears overwhelmingly dominant now, its dominance is not eternal in the way intuition suggests. Mass persists, gravity persists, geometry persists, but influence does not. Influence depends on contrast, and contrast fades as the universe expands and cools. TON 618 formed during an era when gradients were steep, when differences in density, temperature and structure allowed energy to flow violently and visibly. In that era, its presence reshaped its surroundings dramatically, flooding space with radiation, altering galactic evolution, imprinting its influence across immense volumes. But as cosmic time stretches onward, the same object becomes quieter, not because it loses mass, but because the universe around it becomes less responsive. Gas thins, accretion slows, radiation diminishes. The black hole remains vast, but its ability to express that vastness weakens. This reveals a crucial distinction between size and relevance. Size alone does not guarantee lasting impact. Impact requires interaction, and interaction requires available structure. TON 618 demonstrates that even the most extreme objects eventually enter a phase where they persist without consequence. This does not make them smaller, it makes them inert. In a far future universe, TON 618 will still curve space-time deeply, but there will be little left to curve meaningfully. Matter will be sparse, energy gradients will be shallow. The black hole will remain as a gravitational feature in an increasingly uniform cosmos, not because it dominates, but because nothing competes. This reframes the idea of cosmic supremacy. Supremacy is temporary, tied to conditions that allow dominance to matter. When conditions flatten, supremacy dissolves into neutrality. TON 618 thus becomes a bridge between two regimes, a universe rich in contrast and a universe approaching equilibrium. It carries forward the memory of an era when extremes could act, even as that era fades. This temporal aspect adds depth to its significance. TON 618 is not merely large, it is late. Late in the sense that it represents a culmination of growth processes that no longer operate efficiently. It is an artifact of opportunity, not a blueprint for the future. This challenges narratives that imagine cosmic evolution as a march toward ever greater extremes. Instead, TON 618 suggests that the universe explored its extremes early, then began to settle. The largest black holes may already exist. The brightest quasars may already have burned. What remains is persistence, not escalation. This perspective strips away the expectation of drama from the future of the cosmos. There will be no larger-than-ton 618 spectacle awaiting discovery simply because time passed. Discovery will depend on what survived, not on what grew. Ton 618 survived because its mass anchors it against dissolution. Yet survival alone does not guarantee significance. In the long run, significance fades everywhere. This is not pessimism. It is a structural consequence of entropy. Entropy does not destroy objects. It equalizes conditions. As equalization progresses, differences lose leverage. Ton 618's gravity will still exist, but gravity without nearby matter is silent. Curvature without traffic leaves no trace. The black hole becomes a feature of geometry rather than an event generator. This quiet future forces a reconsideration of how we assign meaning to existence. Human minds associate meaning with action, change, and effect. But the universe is under no obligation to maintain conditions that support meaning in that sense. Ton 618 shows that even the most extreme structures eventually transition from active participants to passive fixtures. They do not disappear, they become context. This transition is not abrupt. It unfolds over timescales so long that human categories of beginning, middle, and end dissolve. Ton 618 will not end, dramatically. It will not explode or collapse into something else. It will simply persist while the universe around it thins out, until its presence no longer reorganizes anything of consequence. This persistence without influence is a recurring theme at cosmic scale. Stars burn out, galaxies drift apart, structures remain, but interaction dwindles. Ton 618 is simply the most massive example of this pattern we know. It does not escape the fate of relevance loss, it exemplifies it. In this sense, Ton 618 is not a monument to eternal dominance, but to the temporary nature of impact itself. It teaches that even the largest things are subject not to destruction, but to quiet irrelevance as conditions change. This lesson is uncomfortable because it dissolves the link between magnitude and meaning. We expect the biggest things to matter most. The universe does not agree. Matter matters only when it interacts. Scale matters only when it differentiates. When differentiation fades, scale becomes decorative. Ton 618 will remain large long after it stops mattering in any active way. That realization completes the arc begun when we first ask how big something can be before size stops making sense. Size stops making sense not when it becomes infinite, but when it stops doing anything new. Ton 618 marks that transition. It is large enough to exhaust the explanatory power of largeness itself. Beyond it, size does not add narrative, influence, or insight. It only adds mass. And mass without context is just curvature waiting in silence. Ton 618 ultimately forces a reckoning with the idea that explanation itself is a temporary phenomenon, emerging only under specific conditions where complexity, contrast, and observers coincide. In a universe capable of producing objects this extreme, explanation is not guaranteed by existence. It is enabled by circumstance. Ton 618 exists independently of whether it can be contextualized, understood, or integrated into narrative frameworks. Its reality does not depend on interpretation. This realization subtly inverts the relationship between knowledge and the cosmos. We often assume that the universe invites explanation, that its structures exist to be deciphered, but Ton 618 suggests the opposite. Explanation arises because there are periods when the universe is structured in ways that allow it. not because explanation is fundamental. TON 618 formed during such a period when gradients were steep enough, matter dense enough, and observers would eventually emerge capable of reconstructing its past. But this alignment is temporary. As the universe continues toward equilibrium, the conditions that make explanation meaningful erode. Structures persist, but the pathways through which they generate interpretable change vanish. TON 618 will remain a black hole of enormous mass long after there is nothing left to observe it, nothing left to be influenced by it in a way that produces difference. In that future, explanation ceases not because reality ends, but because relevance does. This reveals something essential about the role of understanding in cosmic context. Understanding is not a property of the universe, it is a relationship between structure and attention. TON 618 once occupied a region where that relationship could form. It will eventually occupy a region where it cannot. And yet its existence remains equally valid in both regimes. This strips explanation of any privileged status. It becomes a phase, not a goal. TON 618 does not represent a puzzle awaiting solution. It represents a condition where all solvable aspects have already been resolved, and what remains is persistence without implication. This is not nihilism, it is precision. It clarifies that the universe does not build toward meaning, nor does it erode it intentionally. Meaning appears where conditions allow, and disappears where they do not, without altering the underlying reality. TON 618 makes this explicit by existing at a scale where meaning thins not because of absence, but because of excess. Too much mass, too much dominance, too much curvature compress the space of interpretation until nothing new can emerge. In that compression, explanation collapses into description, and description collapses into acceptance. The universe does not mark this transition. It does not announce when explanation has run its course. It simply continues. TON 618 stands as a marker we recognize only because we are still close enough, still early enough, still embedded in a universe where contrast remains. From our position, it feels like an endpoint, a place where inquiry arrives and pauses. From the universe's perspective, it is neither endpoint nor pause. It is one configuration among many, persisting as long as the equations allow, indifferent to whether it is framed as ultimate or incidental. This indifference is not hostile, it is structural. It reflects the fact that reality does not optimize for intelligibility. TON 618 does not care that it stretches explanation to the point of saturation. It does not care that human frameworks falter around it. It exists because nothing prohibits its existence, and that, finally, is the most stripped-down truth it offers. The universe is not obligated to stop at scales we find meaningful. It is obligated only to remain consistent. TON 618 is consistent. It is lawful. It is complete. Beyond that, interpretation is optional. TON 618 also quietly dismantles the assumption that scale must culminate in revelation, because at this level, there is no final insight waiting beyond accumulation, no hidden layer where enormity suddenly resolves into meaning. Instead, scale folds back on itself. Once an object becomes dominant enough that it reorganizes everything around it, further dominance does not add complexity, it removes it. Variation collapses. The environment becomes simpler, not richer, because fewer alternatives remain viable. TON 618 does not multiply possibilities, it suppresses them. Matter has fewer paths, fewer stable orbits, fewer long-term configurations. Everything trends inward or outward along constrained trajectories defined by overwhelming curvature. In this way, extreme size does not open new worlds of behavior, it closes them. This inversion is critical because it reveals that the universe's most massive structures are not engines of diversity but agents of reduction. They do not complicate reality, they streamline it. TON 618 simplifies its surroundings by making certain outcomes inevitable. This inevitability strips away contingency, and with it, narrative tension. Stories require branching paths. At this scale, paths converge. Once convergence dominates, explanation becomes repetitive, not because nothing is happening, but because everything that happens belongs to the same class of outcome. This is why discussion of TON 618 eventually circles back to the same themes: mass, curvature, dominance, inevitability. There is nowhere else for the analysis to go without rephrasing itself. That repetition is not a failure of imagination. It is a feature of the regime TON 618 occupies. It sits at a scale where differentiation has been largely exhausted. This realization reframes how we think about the universe's capacity for novelty. Novelty thrives in intermediate regimes, where forces compete, where no single influence overwhelms all others. Planets, ecosystems, galaxies, even stars exist in these contested zones. TON 618 does not. It exists in a regime where competition has already been decided, gravity has won decisively, and everything else responds accordingly. This decisive outcome is what makes it feel final without being terminal. Nothing ends at TON 618. Processes continue, matter moves, time passes. But the space of meaningful variation has narrowed to the point where continuation no longer produces surprise. In this sense, TON 618 is not the end of a process, but the saturation of one. It marks the point where adding more of the same no longer changes the qualitative picture. This saturation echoes a broader cosmic pattern. The universe began in a state of extreme simplicity, diversified rapidly, reached peaks of complexity, and is now gradually simplifying again as expansion and entropy flatten gradients. TON 618 belongs to the downward slope of that arc, even though it formed early. Its presence anticipates a future where dominance without interaction becomes common, where structures persist but do not generate novelty. It is a preview of a universe where existence continues without emphasis. TON 618 therefore functions less as a spectacle and more as a reference point. It shows what happens when scale outpaces relevance, when mass exceeds the conditions needed to make mass interesting. This is not an argument against studying such objects. It is an argument for clarity about what study can yield. Study yields description, not transformation. It yields understanding of limits, not transcendence of them. TON 618 does not invite us to imagine bigger. It invites us to recognize where imagination stops being productive. This recognition is not defeat. It is alignment. It aligns inquiry with the contours of reality, rather than forcing reality into narrative shapes it does not inhabit. In the presence of TON 618, restraint becomes a form of accuracy. Saying less becomes saying more. The object does not need embellishment, because embellishment would imply that something essential is missing. Nothing is missing. TON 618 is complete in its excess. It exists at a scale where completion does not mean closure, but sufficiency. Everything that needs to happen has happened. Everything that can be known in a meaningful way is already available. What remains is persistence without escalation, and that persistence, unadorned and indifferent, may be the most honest expression of cosmic reality available to us. Ton 618 leaves us with a final adjustment that is easy to miss, because it is not dramatic, not technical, and not emotional, but structural. It shows that the universe does not distinguish between extremes and ordinary states in the way human thought does. To the equations that govern reality, a black hole of 60 billion solar masses is not a climax. It is simply a solution. There is no threshold in the mathematics where something becomes too large to be legitimate. The universe does not pause to acknowledge magnitude. It does not escalate its response because scale increases, geometry curves, as required. Trajectories follow their path. Conservation holds. Ton 618 is treated no differently by reality than any other mass concentration except in degree. That indifference strips away the last illusion that size itself carries significance. Significance was always a projection layered on top of structure by observers who evolved in a narrow band of scale where differences mattered for survival. Outside that band, structure persists without commentary. Ton 618 exists in that commentary-free zone. It is not impressive to the universe. It is not excessive. It is not remarkable. It simply is. This realization completes the shift begun earlier, from asking what the universe allows to recognizing that allowance does not imply intention. The universe does not aim toward extremes, nor does it avoid them. It samples possibility where probability permits, then moves on. Ton 618 happened because conditions briefly aligned, not because the universe was building toward a record. When those conditions vanished, the process stopped. The result remained. This pattern is repeated everywhere, at all scales. Mountains form, then erode. Stars ignite, then fade. Galaxies assemble, then disperse. Ton 618 is part of that same rhythm, only stretched across scales so large that the rhythm becomes almost invisible. Its formation was an event. Its existence is a condition. Its future is quiet persistence. This perspective dissolves the temptation to treat Ton 618 as an endpoint. Endpoints imply direction. Direction implies intention. Neither applies. Ton 618 does not mark where the universe arrived. It marks what the universe once allowed. As time continues, the universe will allow fewer such structures, not because it prohibits them, but because the conditions that enable them are gone. In that sense, Ton 618 is not a harbinger of what comes next, but a residue of what has passed. It belongs to a phase of cosmic history that cannot be repeated under current conditions. This makes it precious not because it is rare, but because it is unrepeatable. Yet even this framing must be handled carefully because precious again smuggles in valuation. Ton 618 does not gain value by being unrepeatable. It gains clarity. It clarifies that the universe's most extreme structures are not stepping stones toward something greater, but outcomes of specific moments that do not generalize. The future will not build upon Ton 618. It will move away from it, toward flatter, quieter states where dominance dissolves into uniformity. And in that future, Ton 618 will still exist, massive and lawful, but increasingly irrelevant. This irrelevance is not decay, it is completion. The object has already done everything it was ever going to do in a universe where contrast mattered. What remains is continuation without effect. In recognizing this, we reach the final adjustment Ton 618 asks of us, to let go of the expectation that existence must culminate in something, The universe does not culminate, it persists. Structures rise, saturate, and fade into background conditions. TON 618 is one of the clearest examples of saturation we know. It shows what happens when scale exceeds the domain where new outcomes are possible. Beyond that point, existence does not stop, but it stops changing in ways that matter. And that is not a failure of the universe. It is its long-term behaviour. TON 618 ultimately reframes the concept of permanence in a way that strips it of drama, because permanence at cosmic scale does not mean endurance with significance, but endurance without requirement. The black hole will persist for timescales so long that words like ancient and eternal lose operational meaning, yet that persistence does not imply continued relevance. This is the quiet distinction that TON 618 forces into focus. Something can last longer than any structure capable of noticing it, longer than any process capable of interacting with it in a consequential way, and still obey the same laws that once made it luminous and dominant. Permanence here is not triumph, it is residue. TON 618 is not preserved because it matters, but because nothing removes it. The universe does not curate what survives. It allows survival where removal mechanisms are absent. Black holes, especially ultramassive ones, occupy a category where removal becomes nearly impossible. Hawking radiation will eventually erode them, but on timescales so vast that the concept of erosion itself becomes abstract. Long before that, the universe will have emptied of stars, thinned of gas, cooled into a state where interaction itself becomes rare. In that context, TON 618's continued existence does not signal dominance, it signals inertia. It is not doing anything, but nothing is undoing it. This exposes a deeper principle about cosmic structure. The universe does not privilege activity over inactivity. It does not reward complexity with persistence. It simply follows what conservation allows. TON 618 persists because it is an efficient configuration of mass energy under gravity, not because it is extreme. In fact, its extremity contributes to its stability. Once mass collapses beyond a certain threshold, there is no internal mechanism left to disrupt it. This makes ultramassive black holes some of the most stable structures the universe can produce, not in the sense of dynamic equilibrium, but in the sense of resistance to change. Yet this stability is hollow of meaning. It does not generate new structure, it merely endures. This endurance without contribution reframes how we think about the legacy of cosmic objects. Legacy implies impact over time. TON 618's impact is front-loaded. It shaped its environment when conditions allowed interaction. Once those conditions faded, the legacy ceased to grow. What remains is mass without narrative. This realization dismantles a subtle expectation that size guarantees historical importance. History at cosmic scale is written during periods of transition, not during periods of stasis. TON 618's history is already complete, even though its existence is not. This separation between history and persistence is crucial. It means that the most massive objects in the universe are not necessarily the most historically significant over long timescales. They are significant briefly, then neutral indefinitely. TON 618 teaches that the universe does not preserve influence, only structure. Influence requires gradients. Structure can persist without them. As gradients flatten, influence dissolves, but structure remains, frozen not in time, but in relevance. This frozen relevance is not failure. It is the expected outcome of a universe governed by entropy. Entropy does not destroy, it equalizes. Equalization removes leverage. Without leverage, even the largest masses cannot do anything new. TON 618 becomes a monument not to power, but to the exhaustion of difference. In this sense, it mirrors the fate of the universe itself. The universe will not end in collapse or explosion, but in neutrality, where everything that exists continues without altering anything else in a meaningful way. TON 618 anticipates that state. It is already there locally. It already exists in a regime where scale has stopped producing novelty. This makes it a preview, not of cosmic destruction, but of cosmic completion. Completion here does not imply finality. There is no final moment, no last event. There is only a gradual transition into a condition where nothing remains to be decided. TON 618 is one of the earliest large-scale expressions of that condition. It demonstrates that even at the height of mass concentration, the universe is already moving toward irrelevance of distinction. This is not bleak, it is neutral. Neutrality is not absence, it is sufficiency. Nothing more is required for the universe to continue. TON 618 continues because continuation requires nothing beyond consistency, and consistency is the one thing the universe always provides. TON 618 ultimately dissolves the idea that the universe is oriented toward outcomes at all, because when examined at this scale, outcome itself loses definition. Outcomes imply divergence, the sense that one state could have meaningfully differed from another, and that such difference would matter. At the scale TON 618 occupies, divergence has already collapsed. The black hole exists in a regime where alternative histories no longer produce alternative presents. Whether it accreted slightly faster or slower, whether its spin settled at one value or another, the end state remains overwhelmingly similar, an ultramassive concentration of mass embedded in a universe that gradually becomes less capable of responding to it. This convergence strips away counterfactual significance. The universe did not choose TON 618 over some other outcome. It simply followed the most probable path given the conditions available. Once that path was taken, deviation became irrelevant. This reframes causality not as a branching tree, but as a narrowing funnel. Early in cosmic history, many branches were available. As time passed, those branches collapsed into fewer viable configurations. TON 618 sits near the narrow end of that funnel, not because it is inevitable in every universe, but because in this universe, once conditions aligned, its emergence became statistically locked in. After that point, nothing short of fundamental law-breaking could have prevented its existence. This realization removes drama from causation. There was no decisive moment when TON 618 became unavoidable. Inevitability emerged gradually as alternatives faded. This gradual locking in is characteristic of large-scale structure formation. The universe does not snap into outcomes, it slides into them as probability landscapes flatten. TON 618 illustrates this with unusual clarity, because its scale makes the flattening obvious. Once mass concentration passed a certain threshold, everything else followed predictably. Accretion disks formed, radiation flowed, feedback shaped the surroundings, and eventually growth slowed. The process did not culminate, it saturated. Saturation is not an event, it is a condition where nothing remains to compete. This is why TON 618 feels less like a climax and more like a plateau. It represents the exhaustion of growth pathways rather than their fulfillment. In this sense, TON 618 is not a singular marvel, but a structural inevitability given enough density and time. This challenges the way human narratives assign meaning to extremes. Extremes feel special because they are rare, but rarity alone does not imply purpose. TON 618 is rare because the conditions that formed it were rare, not because the universe was aiming toward rarity. Once those conditions existed, rarity ceased to matter. The object formed because it could, and once formed, it persisted because nothing counteracted it. This persistence without intention exposes a deeper truth about cosmic existence. The universe is not goal-directed. It does not optimize for complexity, elegance, or symmetry beyond what law requires. It explores what is available, then remains where it lands. TON 618 is one such landing. It does not point forward to a destiny, nor backward to a plan. It simply occupies a stable configuration within the allowable space of reality. This strips away the temptation to read significance into scale itself. Scale is descriptive, not prescriptive. It tells us what happened, not what should have happened. TON 618 happened. That is sufficient. In recognizing this, we arrive at a perspective that is neither awestruck nor dismissive, but aligned. The universe is vast enough to produce objects that exceed intuition without exceeding law. It is old enough to allow saturation without finality. It is indifferent enough to let existence persist without explanation. TON 618 stands quietly within this indifference, not as a challenge to understanding, but as a reminder that understanding is contingent, local, and temporary. Beyond that contingency, reality continues exactly as it always has, indifferent to whether it is framed as extreme or ordinary. TON 618 exists on that side of framing, where labels no longer add clarity, and where the most accurate description is simply that it remains. TON 618 brings us to a point where even the language we use to describe reality begins to feel provisional, not because words are inadequate in general, but because adequacy itself loses relevance when nothing depends on interpretation anymore. At this scale, the universe does not reward precision with deeper consequence. Whether we describe TON 618 as the largest known black hole, one of the most massive gravitational structures, or simply an extreme concentration of mass makes no difference to what it is or what it does. Labels slide off without effect. The object remains unchanged. This exposes a quiet asymmetry between reality and description. Description depends on contrast. It gains meaning when differences alter outcomes. But TON 618 exists in a regime where differences have already flattened. Its presence overwhelms nuance. Once mass reaches this magnitude, small variations no longer propagate into meaningful distinctions. They exist mathematically, but not structurally. The universe registers them, but does not respond differently because of them. This is the deeper reason why explanation begins to feel redundant, not because we lack information, but because additional information does not reorganize the system. TON 618 sits in a domain where reality has already settled into its dominant configuration. The processes that formed it are finished. The processes that might undo it operate on timescales so vast that they effectively remove urgency from the concept of change. In this sense, TON 618 does not merely represent extreme size, it represents temporal disengagement. It exists in a zone where time still passes, but passing no longer accumulates into transformation. This disengagement mirrors the broader trajectory of the universe itself. Early on, time mattered intensely. Small differences amplified, Structures formed, energy flowed. Later, time mattered less, change slowed, systems saturated. TON 618 embodies that transition locally. It is a structure formed at the peak of dynamism that now persists into quiet. This persistence without participation is the clearest signal that the universe does not treat existence as a process aimed at novelty. Novelty is a phase, saturation is another. TON 618 belongs to the latter. Its continued presence does not generate new outcomes. It simply maintains a configuration that no longer competes with alternatives. In human terms, this feels anticlimactic, because we associate scale with drama and endurance with importance. But the universe does not share that association. Importance is not a physical property. It does not appear in equations. TON 618 has no more importance than a small black hole or a drifting particle, except in how it once influenced its surroundings. Once that influence fades, what remains is mass-obeying geometry. Nothing more is required. This reframing removes the last temptation to search for meaning embedded in size itself. Meaning was always something layered on top by observers capable of caring about difference. TON 618 persists beyond that layer. It exists in a region of reality where caring would make no difference even if it were possible. This does not diminish the object, it clarifies it. TON 618 is not a symbol, it is not a message, it is not a warning, it is a consequence of density, gravity, and time intersecting under permissive conditions. Once that intersection occurred, the result followed inevitably. Now the universe moves on, not by erasing the result, but by making it increasingly irrelevant to further change. This irrelevance is not emptiness, it is completion. There is nothing left for TON 618 to accomplish. It has already expressed everything its existence allows it to express. From here forward, it simply remains as part of the universe's background structure, not active, not evolving in any consequential way, not building toward anything else. It is a reminder that reality does not need to resolve into an ending to be finished with a process. Sometimes finishing means stabilization. TON 618 is stabilized excess. It is what remains after growth has exhausted itself. And with that recognition, we approach the final adjustment, where even the idea of conclusion must be handled carefully, because the universe does not conclude. It only continues under different conditions. TON 618 does not conclude anything, and that may be its most honest contribution. It exists at a scale where conclusions themselves stop being relevant, where the universe does not arrive anywhere, but simply persists under the same constraints that have always governed it. The desire for a final statement, a takeaway, or a resolution is a human impulse shaped by lives that unfold over short spans and depend on change for meaning. At the scale TON 618 occupies, that impulse no longer maps cleanly onto reality. Nothing about the object asks to be wrapped up. Nothing about its existence points forward or backward in a way that demands narrative closure. It is complete not because it has reached an end, but because nothing remains unfinished. The processes that created it have already played out. The processes that will undo it operate on timescales so extreme that the distinction between future and permanence dissolves. TON 618 remains massive, lawful, and indifferent, embedded in a universe that continues to expand, cool, and flatten without regard for significance. This indifference is not absence, it is neutrality. Neutrality is what remains when outcomes no longer diverge in ways that matter. In this regime, reality does not seek novelty, escalation, or culmination. It maintains consistency. TON 618 fits perfectly within that consistency. It does not violate expectations. It reveals how provisional expectations always were. The universe was never obligated to stop short of such extremes. It was never obligated to make them comprehensible. It was only obligated to remain internally coherent. TON 618 satisfies that obligation fully. Its existence tells us nothing about destiny, purpose, or finality. It tells us something quieter and more durable, that the universe allows configurations to arise when conditions permit, and once arisen, those configurations persist until conditions change enough to make persistence impossible. There is no moral arc, no cosmic preference guiding this process. There is only probability unfolding across vast scales of space and time. TON 618 is one expression of that unfolding, neither privileged nor condemned by its size. When viewed this way, the phrase, "the point where size stops making sense," becomes less a warning and more a description of alignment. Size stops making sense not because the universe breaks, but because sense itself was never a property of scale. Sense belonged to observers navigating a narrow band of reality, where differences were actionable and consequences immediate. Outside that band, reality continues without reference to interpretation. TON 618 lives entirely outside that band. It does not need to be understood to exist. It does not need to be remembered to persist. It does not need to matter to remain real. And that is not a failure of understanding. It is an accurate portrait of a universe that does not depend on comprehension for its continuation. In the end, there is no final image, no last insight that reshapes everything that came before. There is only the recognition that reality does not culminate in revelation. It stabilizes, it persists, it remains consistent long after meaning fades. TON 618 does not stand at the edge of existence. It stands within it, quietly demonstrating that even the largest structures are simply configurations of law and time, neither demanding interpretation nor offering closure. The universe does not finish its story here. It does not pause. It does not turn toward an ending. It continues, carrying everything that can remain, including TON 618, forward into a future where change becomes increasingly subtle, influence increasingly rare, and existence increasingly sufficient without emphasis. That is not an ending. It is what remains when endings no longer apply